So there seems to be a decent amount of interest in my personal life in Lithuania. Whether it's how I ended up here, how I met my wife, or how my wife and I settled into our new apartment. Continuing this series, I thought it might be interesting to tell you the story of how we got married here in Lithuania. From the paperwork, to the ceremony, to the reception. It will either be useful for some fellow foreigners who might do something similar, or it might just scare them away and encourage a ceremony somewhere else. So let's get started. Well, I've talked a little bit about my experience of how to legally get married in Lithuania for one of my early videos. That video was more of an instructional piece, and I think it might be more interesting to frame the whole thing as more of a personal story. So where can I begin? I guess it all started on a cold, dark night in February when I proposed. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to propose at a fancy restaurant or somewhere super public, because I've tried doing those things in the past, and they didn't work out too well. I'm just kidding. This was my first and only proposal. I asked my wife to marry me while we were out for a walk in the snow. I chose one of my favorite little roads in our neighborhood of Fabioniškės, where I knew there wouldn't be much traffic, and at the time, it was an unpaved road covered by trees and mostly surrounded by forest. Covered in snow, it looked quite nice and somewhat romantic. Sadly, since then, they've paved that road and a few houses have popped up along the side, and so I guess it wouldn't be as memorable or special or romantic nowadays. Well, of course, she said yes, and so we would eventually start planning the wedding. There were a lot of things we had to take into consideration that a couple of Lithuanians getting married now wouldn't need to worry about. One, it was COVID time, and there were still a lot of travel restrictions, and so leaving the country and having some kind of event elsewhere, like Canada, wouldn't be so straightforward. Number two, the pandemic also meant that there were restrictions on how many people could gather, and vaccination status was also something that mattered. And three, I had to consider my ability to stay in the country, since my visa would be expiring later in the year. We also wanted to leave enough time for me to get my residence permit on the basis of being married. Okay, so this last point could probably be seen as very suspicious to some people. Was I getting married just so I could stay in Europe? No. I knew that she was the one, and yes, I do still love her. But would getting married make our lives a lot easier when it comes to being able to physically stay in the same place together? Definitely. I was definitely open to the possibility of having to leave Lithuania once my visa time was finished, and I was also open to the reality that I might have to spend 3 months out of the country and then come back 3 months at a time. I'm a remote worker, and so thankfully that part of my life wasn't a complicating factor. This scenario could have happened, but we both knew that we would get married sooner or later, and so the circumstances were, let's say, encouraging us to do it sooner. One slight side note here, I believe the Lithuanian Migration Department is well aware of what they call marriages of convenience, and how certain people might arrange to get married just to stay in the country. I've heard of stories where a migration officer will perform a surprise visit to make sure the newly married couple is actually living together and that it wasn't a fraudulent marriage. But in our 2+ years of being married, we've never had that happen.
I dig deeper. I look at your phone records. I talk to your neighbors. I interview your coworkers. If your answers don't match up at every point, you will be deported indefinitely, and you, young man, will have committed a felony.
Anyways, while most wedding planning is usually focused on the venue and who to invite, our main priority had to be getting all of my paperwork in order. Now, I'm sure we could have gone through the entire process all by ourselves, but when you're facing a limited window of time, getting it done right the first time is extra important. So we sought the services of an immigration lawyer to guide us through the process. It's been a while, but I'll try to summarize this part as much as possible, since it could be boring and irrelevant to some. So it's important to know that you can only officially legally marry in Lithuania if at least one person in the couple is either a Lithuanian citizen or a resident of the country. Foreigners will require some additional documentation. A birth certificate is required, and for foreigners, Lithuania requires a document issued by the competent authorities of his or her state certifying that there are no obstacles to the marriage. In short, they want a document that says that you're not already married. As a foreigner from outside the EU, all of this had to be legalized or certified with an apostille and then be translated. The Canadian Embassy here in Vilnius was quick to prepare a document stating that I wasn't already married, but our immigration lawyer didn't think it would be good enough. So I had to get a certificate from the province of British Columbia, prepared and then mailed. Needless to say, it was a hassle with the added stress of a timeline. My mother in Vancouver was instrumental in preparing and sending all of the documents to Lithuania, and well, let's just say that DHL made a good amount of money from us. We could have saved money by going through standard mail, but we heard a horror story of someone trying this and having documents just never show up. So we decided to be safe and spend the extra money for one of the big courier services. After all of this was done, planning the actual wedding was the easy part for a few reasons. Number one, it was pandemic time, and so gatherings couldn't be too big. The pandemic also meant that people weren't traveling as much because of all the hassle of either vaccination proof or pre-flight COVID testing, and so again, there were fewer people we felt that we could invite from Canada or elsewhere. And three, my wife and I don't like huge groups, and we both would especially hate being the center of attention. So with a small guest list combined with neither of us being all that religious, we had our ceremony here in Vilnius at the Civil Registry Office, which apparently is also known as the Marriage Palace. Having lived in the Naujamiestis area of Vilnius for a few months, I was already familiar with this building, and I'd walked by numerous times and seen couples in wedding outfits with their families. I guess many jurisdictions have ceremonies at, like, City Hall, but in Vilnius, it's done at this interesting building. It's strange, old, and very, very Soviet era. Definitely quite the surreal experience for someone who grew up in Canada. I think our ceremony took place around 11 a.m., and so we arranged for a small lunchtime reception. We chose Mo Bistro, part of the Mo Museum, as the venue for our very small group, and we arranged to have tickets to the museum for our guests while they waited for us as we were having our photos taken. Our photos were taken in the courtyard of the Presidential Palace and also in the Old Town, but mainly just one street and the Vilnius University courtyard. I'm fairly happy with how the photos turned out, but I was not happy at all with how we had to deal with the photographer and her really slow communication, which made things so stressful. Honestly, I was a few hours away from dropping her and finding someone else. But at the very last minute, she sent the paperwork and we finalized her services. As mentioned before, our reception was at Mo Bistro. We've had a few good experiences here, both before and after our wedding. My wife likes to joke, though, that we're now quite embarrassed to tell anyone that we had our event there, since our last recent experience a few weeks ago was just so bad. Like there was some kind of big change in management or staff or something. It just feels like it's gone downhill since 2021 or 2022. But yeah, I don't know if we would be able to recommend this place now, whether for an event or even just lunch. Back to the wedding day, it was a beautiful crisp day in early September and lunch was wrapped up pretty quickly. There were no speeches aside from me standing up to thank everyone for coming, and so there was a lot of the day left. I suggested that we go up to the top of Gediminas Castle Hill as a group, and so a bunch of us slowly walked there. Many of the ladies wearing their high-heeled shoes weren't so thrilled about having to walk through the rocky streets of the Old Town. Oops. But at least we took the funicular up and we enjoyed the great view while taking photos to remember the day. And so that, my friends, is the story of how we got married. Considering how much of a hassle the paperwork was, I was quite happy to have a very simple event. And my wife fully agrees. I think the pandemic was a huge factor in what we could and couldn't do. I was so shocked to learn that some parts of the world require a lot less documentation to get married when compared to Lithuania. Like in the United States, so many states don't require people to be residents, and all you need is some form of official photo ID. Had we been able to travel, seriously, it might have been easier to fly to one of those places, get married, and then come back to Lithuania with an official legalized marriage certificate. I know some people will want to go all out for their wedding, but for us, we were happy to keep it small and on a small budget in order to save money for bigger things in life. Ultimately, we were quite satisfied with how it all turned out. And so, to wrap things up, the Lithuanian word of the day will be, well, the obvious one, santuoka, which means marriage. Santuoka. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.